Ahsoka, Balance of Truth, Book 1, Chapter 26. Vader knew he was becoming a detriment to himself, fixated as he was on confluences and meanings he would never comprehend. He and his master were at an impasse, himself having no interest in a subjugated galaxy he could not actively control, his master too involved with the inner workings of essential maintenance in his empire to delve further into the mysteries they both had sworn to unfold. He had understood long ago that the man had manipulated him, seeking a fortuitous kinship to explore the possibilities the Force held, but that had faded over time. Vader had maintained an unconscionable vigilance in defending perspective to shout to the galaxy that he had never wavered from his intended agenda. Sidious, on the other hand, was constantly elusive, from broad conversations about Sith and Jedi lore to nothing for weeks. Arms crossed tightly about his broad chest, he stared into space from the active viewport. The scattering of stars that occupied a space formerly occupied by Alderaan was pleasing and foreboding. To witness the destructive power firsthand had been quite impressive, but the totality of the wrath rendered was wholly unjustified. The issue itself would never lie in what had occurred, only in the how. He understood Tarkin's decision to make Alderaan the example. However, he disagreed. He seemed to be the only one who understood what they were indeed up against. In fact, was a full-scale rebellion. The last one had lasted 3 years. Examples such as this would only be an effective tool against insurgency. He knew Alderaan would be nothing more than a motivator, with his station as the primary target. A combined effort from master and apprentice, utilizing the full, naked, and raw power of the Force, would have been an outright statement that could have not ever been ignored, rebellion or not. This monstrosity of achievement was just another thing, no different than a blaster or a starfighter. Tangibility is only necessary until it is no more. He understood this, yes, yet his master did not. Through his awakening, he learned this and remembered it. Sidious himself was just as tangible. No, he thought quickly. For reasons he could yet still not explain, he knew his master still held a great deal of knowledge he had yet to learn. His patience was running thin. He thought his failure to obtain the stolen plans may be a blessing. Pausing his mind briefly, Vader closed his eyes behind the mask and felt for his connection to the Force. With the rhythmic intake and exhalations of breath, the only sound audible to him, he quickly established what he sought. A massive influx of energy entered him, and he brought his hands down at his sides to maintain his balance or risk falling forward. He heard hurried footsteps behind him on the command deck. "Leave me be," he commanded them without turning his head. The torrid current of Force energy was wholly unexpected and brought a flood of elements he had not invited. Visions, faces, words, voices, explosions, colors, memories, thoughts, feelings, and emotions. He was unprepared for the deluge, so he brought his left knee down as if in genuflection and placed his hands on the floor before him. "Lord Vader," a voice came from behind him. "I said leave me be. I will not repeat myself again." His deep voice echoed through the room wildly, sounding odd to him as the reverberations found purchase. The waves of images and other sensory triggers made no sense to him. His mind, which he was always trying to quiet, was forced into a haze of distraction. Memories, Anakin's memories, forced their way straight through the defensive mechanisms he had erected like a wrecking ball. The flickering images were cycling so fast he couldn't put a face to them, except for the likeness of Obi-Wan. Master, he thought to himself, or Anakin thought, again laying waste to those same defensive endeavors. His image had immense clarity as it recycled through his mind. Images from when he was a child, from meeting his future master for the first time, the death of Qui-Gon still fresh, which brought with it the short lament of the fallen Jedi and how, even then, the man had seemed different. Someday I'll be the first to see them all, the words turning into an abusive inflection of mocking tribute, sounding as if in a whisper to himself, not the words of a 10-year-old boy excitedly rambling over his prospects for the future, but a twisted reminder of a life path that would never be. Memory brought pain, but pain was nothing more abnormal to him than food was to his former self. Pain is his sustenance. The images began cycling again, and Obi-Wan kept returning to him more frequently. Obi-Wan on Vancor. He would never forget, could never forget, the transformation his hubris had taken within a brief time, and ultimately the apparent reawakening of his former master. A lone image posited in his mind, one of his former Padawan, not the young woman she had been, but an older version of her. She said nothing, only stood before him with her eyes closed. Before he could divine any reason for her inclusion, her eyes flew open. Her visage adopted a steadfast and unyielding anger, her mouth twisted in hatred, and her eyes burning with rage. She ignited a deep red saber and thrust it toward him. The image vanished in less time than he could process anything from it, and cycled back to that of Obi-Wan again. Was that fear? He thought. His mind routed itself toward lamenting the loss, that of time and person, but he would never allow that path to follow itself to fruition. What's done is done. However, he would never allay that mindset to that of Padme. No, he said to himself yet again, there remains a way, and I will find it, if even by myself, because he knew his current master would not, had not, assisted with anything of the sort. The man had waylaid and misled his every endeavor to cross over to or confound death for any purpose. Vader needed to refocus. His mind had wandered too far from his objective, yet he knew enough from the bond he had always possessed with his instinct not to ignore the messages from his mental ventures. He knew his struggle with Obi-Wan was unresolved. He knew an injunction was on the horizon between him and his master. He knew the thoughts of Padme still distracted him completely, and he also knew that this battle station was the worst place for him to be right now in the galaxy. "My lord," a voice repeated for a third time, pulling Vader back into reality. "There are consequences for defying," Vader began. "Yes, of course, my lord. We have just intercepted a YT-1300 freighter decanting from lightspeed," the voice responded. "Enough," Vader snapped, cutting off the bridge officer, and rose to his feet, resting his mechanical arms on his hips and refocusing on the starfield before him in the viewport. The black orbs of his mask reflected each star within view. "Finally, my old master, we can rid ourselves of this eternal conflict." Without warning, he turned and made for the turbolift. "My lord? My lord?" The voice trailed after him, but he ignored it completely. Kawani stared at the still intact saber she held in both hands before her. Strapped in the folding acceleration seat in the cargo bay, she had discontinued her futile efforts to open the thing and only enacted an obtuse stare as she felt the ship lurching forward. Her mind was swimming with all that she had experienced over the last 24 hours, or so, at times utterly aware of her place in active conversation, at others completely oblivious to what was being said. She had not felt excluded, far from it, simply that she had no idea what was being referenced through much of it and could pick up next to nothing through context. In reality, it didn't matter to her. Her place in the rebellion and her role were essential to her. Her fondness for the Togruta was vital to her, and she had no idea where that relationship would take her, or how she would actively define it. Mustafar sounded suicidal to her, but she trusted Ahsoka in ways that transcended the very meaning of the word. Hence, she prepared her response when Ahsoka inevitably told her she wasn't coming along. She was mentally ready for that exchange and doubled down on the saber before her. "It would help if I knew anything about lightsabers," she thought. "Of that, I can be of assistance." A deep whisper wavered through the cargo bay. "I was wondering when you would announce your presence," Kawani said, without lifting her gaze or losing concentration on the task. "I've felt you since we landed," she said in a low voice. "Tragic to think I have I may have been forgotten, but alas, young Mary Allen, you've lightened my spirits. The whisper was beginning to merge into a known characteristic. Tsar, what exactly can you help with? Kawani said directly, bypassing any formalities. Straight to business, then, the disembodied voice said with embellishment. Your task, although possible, is made quite easier by understanding what lies within. It is a task assigned to anyone, be they Jedi or Sith, or anyone in between, to fully comprehend, respect, and appreciate the weapon before them, he continued. I could, of course, look inside and describe it in full detail, but then the lesson is lost on you, he said, revealing a modicum of credibility to his intentions. No, no, Kowani said. I just don't know what I don't know. I've seen an active blade, of course, you know that, but I've no notion of what is involved. Give me a DC-15 and I'd have it apart, cleaned, and reassembled in less time than a Wookiee can dismember a Sulistan, she said confidently. That is a dilemma then, Tsar said, understanding. I can assist more unorthodoxly, but would need your consent. Kawani understood what this meant, and was hesitant at first before thinking about a possible danger and her ability to nullify that danger. I understand what you are referring to, and with that, I need you to understand that at any time in that condition, I could cut you off from your source, she said with all seriousness. It would not be a matter of personal retribution, mind you, simply one of survival. So we have an accord, Tsar intoned. Ceasing to exist is not in my best interests. Your Togrutan friend showed me that door, and I am in no rush to step through it. Kawani paused on that very fact. Why had Ahsoka not told her about Tsar's fate? Unless she didn't know what the outcome had been, of course. The thought was both satisfied as an answer and created its own difficulty. She is deeply devoted to her cause, which aligns beneficially with my own to a staggering degree. If her will is compromised, I guarantee I will shove you right through that door and obliterate the evidence, she said with no level of sarcasm. Yes, we have an accord. Tsar did not hesitate, but entered and took up residence within the spirit of Kawani, the two vying for superiority for a fraction of a second before coming to an agreement of sorts, a symbiosis neither had anticipated initially. Kawani felt the well of openness and vulnerability unnerving, and was prepared to discontinue the experience immediately before feeling a sense of calm spread throughout her entire body, eliciting a craving hunger for it to continue. His thoughts melded with her own to create a disorienting but vast sense of time and space. Her immediate surroundings were lost in a blur of imported knowledge and experience. She immediately knew what was involved in not only the saber before her, but in the sanctity of its very creation and how intimately personal it was. Kawani's mind, the portion she would never allow Tsar access, was acutely aware of the part the Force played in any saber's construction, but, more importantly, the part it played in this one. She felt desperation and anxiety, but in a controlled manner, as if this blade were constructed out of defiance and principle. She felt a measure of anger and regret, not of a deep rage, but whatever the situation was, or that had arisen to necessitate its construction. She could not read the intent beyond the emotion employed to give it purpose, and was surprised to see so much of it deployed for a singular reason. The mechanical aspect of the device was in full display within her consciousness, thanks to the melding of Zar. Surprise was her first measured response at how intricate the inner workings were. Conductors, insulators, power cells, energy gating, the focal points of the crystals themselves, all of it was now known to her in the same way her subconscious understood the inner workings of the DC-15. As she unfolded certain aspects of the Force by the minute, the hard facts of reality were congealing and adhering to that same understanding, creating a different perspective entirely. Kawani began to feel the Force itself flowing in and around each component separately, defining them individually as they resided within the housing. They, in turn, informed her of their purpose within the whole, and she understood then fully what was in her hands. She closed her eyes and continued to see the saber lying between both open palms, splitting the seams between two halves of the hilt. Ahsoka created the grip with two separate structures, but fused them in the Force to prevent a flawless, inviolate entity. The wires, inner housings, chambers, and emitter made perfect sense to her, and called attention to themselves to be maintained and cleaned correctly. Kawani placed importance on every facet of the crystals first, but every component after that to nullify her carelessness in the swamp. Each, in turn, responded with a pristine presentation, assuring her the objective was complete, to which she gave it importance until finally she reached the emitter housing and stifled a short burst of laughter as the dried mud presented her earlier efforts in undeniable reality. She physically pulled at the mud on either side of the vacancy until it was all removed. She felt Zar's approval that the process was complete and skillfully executed, a shared feeling, she reminded herself. He had as much, if not more, to do with the outcome as she thought. Kawani laid her hands over the inner workings once more before viewing the entirety again in the Force. Satisfied, she asked the Force to return both halves to their flawless, intact state. Again, she felt the weight leave her hands and heard audible reports of the task completing itself. As the hilt settled again into her open palm, she opened her eyes, realizing then that she had them closed the entire time. The saber hilt was as if brand new in her grasp as she visually inspected her work. Wrapping her right hand around it, she unbuckled herself from the seat and stood in the center of the cargo bay. The emitter shroud pointed behind her. She engaged the activator and felt the heat from the blade and a satisfying confidence wash over her as the snap hiss rang clearly through the room. She swung it slowly before her, shifting her grip to one more unorthodox for the hilt, but one that would allow her to see and appreciate her accomplishment fully. It bathed the bay in its bright white glow, shadows from utilities attached to the walls, spreading in contrast to the approaching light. Running from it, she thought, in line with her visual perception. You hold a brilliant weapon before you, young Mirialan, one constructed with a purity of purpose. But it is so much more than that, Zar said to her. They are symbols, beacons of one's intent and willingness to uncompromisingly submit to the powers of the Force, in whatever manner the wielder sees fit. Conduits of unadulterated accomplishment, Kawani stated in a form of question. Yes and no, came Zar's response in her mind. They can be, yes, to one that is disinterested in the vices of all sentient beings. They can also be adulterated, violated, and mutilated to one that views nothing as a vice. I understand that, Kawani responded in what would seem to herself or to anyone else. Others still can be created with pure intent, purpose of personal sorts, and thus become powerful instruments to their respective wielder, he continued. You said wielder and not the creator? Kawani said aloud again. No need to shout, young one. I am right here. Yes, with purpose, to answer your question, Tsar said. It will take time to get used to this arrangement, she thought. Hearing bellicose laughter in her mind out of pure amusement gave her the validation to assure herself he could hear her unspoken questions. Kawani could not take her eyes off the stark white blade as she turned herself slowly, dancing the hilt before her. The rhythmic hum of the energy blade displacing the air before its approach was mesmerizing, and she passed it quickly in a figure eight to speed the melodic hum. Excited as the whoosh accompanied a more audible hum relative to the speed at which she moved it. There is more to the experience than just waving it around, Zar said. Of course there is. Let me have my piece in the moment, please, she responded in thought and not audibly. She returned the hilt to a more natural grip, with the blade behind her again, and could not help but see herself in a new pose with a blaster in her left hand, defensive stance employed and ready to take on the Empire. Ease your impatience. There is much to learn so that you do not wound yourself, or worse, before you ever have a chance to put practice to play, he all but scolded her. Understanding a lightsaber's capability forced her back into the more unnatural grip, and she then gave it a little more respect and distanced it from her body. They are beacons of light in their right hands, but can deal mortal damage, young one. Very few things resist their power, but your flesh is not one of them. And right now, we both prosper with your ability to live, as it were, Tsar intoned. The advice was well timed, she thought to herself, but then quickly wondered what more advantages would benefit from this arrangement. I know nothing of wielding this thing. The laugh was in her head again. Of that I already know. In time and with diligent practice, I will show you. You mentioned intent when they are created. Does a saber inherit additional qualities or power from its creator? Kawani thought. Although I will endeavor to remain intelligible in my responses, some will remain elusive, as I do not possess certain knowledge. Of your inquiry, I can only say yes, but the source of this information will be a better person to ask, Tsar responded. Kawani adopted a befuddled look, unsure how to phrase a question that would have the outward appearance of her asking herself. People are going to think I am insane. Until you find equilibrium with our arrangement, yes. Not helpful at the moment, she thought. I do perceive the question that is, as of yet, unasked, and it is to your master that I refer, Sarah responded. She has displayed a use of the Force even I cannot comprehend. In that, you are truly blessed to be learning from her. I can't possibly know how much there is to learn, but she hasn't stopped teaching since she promised she would, Kawani thought in return, a smile that felt perfectly timed, spreading her dark lips thin. From two sources you will have counsel then. In deference to your commitments and loyalty, I will never overstep that boundary. It is a selfish motive of mine to phrase it that way, but I feel she has much to teach me as well, Tsar admitted. Providing there is approval of this, she said, extinguishing the blade and raising both hands in the air. Yes, of course, and may I commend you on adopting and adhering to a certain safety measure before decapitating yourself with that gesture. So, Tsar Ek does have a sense of humor. It is not a known Zeltran trait, but one tends to find new horizons when an eternity is at one's disposal, Tsar said, mildly sarcastic. We're going to get along just fine, I think, she thought with a smile. Now reignite that thing. And let's get some simple forms before you present our current status to your master, Tsar said. Before we resume, I will need some tunes. She reached into the small pocket within the larger one at her left knee, retrieved a small hollow chip, walked over to the audio console set into the wall near the manual loading ramp controls, slammed it in, keyed in the track 12, and closed her eyes. A deep bass shook the bay, followed by high tweeting electronic chirps and a swiftly cadenced rhythm of various percussion instruments. An ear for the classics. Spanner Wrench by Photon Trio. Yes, Miss Yamat, we're going to get along just fine indeed. Kawani tapped her wristcom 3 times, stepped with her left foot to the circulating beat, and reignited the saber, bathing the cargo bay in its bright white glow. Ahsoka could feel the incursion, the force tearing at itself in a stoic measure of resolve and a childish tantrum. Her understanding of a balanced force always worked against her. Things that should be defined or natural was far from both parameters as they could be. Vigilance, Ahsoka, she told herself. Her mind was a blossoming storm of confusion, or more directly, a storm of activity that demanded her attention to create a path through the chaos of action. Mustafar had held her attention and had been a priority since, by her admission, the Clone Wars. Stealing children for whatever purpose was and would always be an abomination of any effort, regardless of intentions. Yes, there were stones yet unturned on that blasted planet, and yes, it was also the home of Vader. Why he chose that place was a mystery to her. It certainly could not have been for any reason they had both shared or experienced, and most certainly not because it was the site of his ultimate failure. But then, why was she so determined to explore this avenue if not confront him? She was truthful with Master Yoda that Vader was not, nor would ever be her intent. But Hera's comment had not escaped her notice. She was positive she wasn't being prodded through means unknown to her to force an unwanted confrontation with her former master again. If that were the case, was Anakin himself behind it, or Sidious perhaps? These answers would begin to expose themselves there, on Mustafar. That was reason enough to begin where she was being pulled to the strongest, the end. She had not survived this long without listening to her instincts and advice. Why would either of them, or the Empire in general, be looking for her in all places anyway? Where they would least expect you to show, she said to herself. Nobody would have the ability to talk her out of that. Her mind was made up. She paused the chaos within her thoughts and focused on her surroundings for the remainder of the time she could view them through the transparisteel. Swirling clouds of what seemed to her a planet encompassing a congregation of steamy mist that gave way to a bright, shining sun well above the treetops. A conflagration of every shade of gray imaginable, broken only by the tallest showai, reflected the light in every direction, bathing distant mountains in a wash of browns and greens. I didn't even know those were there, she said to no one in particular, momentarily considering getting a better look. She stamped the curiosity back into its hole and continued her path up the well. I will have to make it a point to come back here at some point, she thought as the atmospheric blue transitioned into the inky black of space. Feeling the relief that making progress inevitably elicits, she was frozen in place by the unimaginable cacophony of sounds coming from the cargo bay and reached over immediately for the onboard comm. Ani, what happened down there? Are you okay? There was a short pause before she heard what sounded like a malfunctioning airlock and subsequent dispersal into space of an entire load of raw metallic disks, followed by silence. Ani? She was genuinely concerned. Yeah, you don't like my music much, huh? Kawani responded with an electronic crackle. Ahsoka had no idea how to respond to that. Music, yes. That? No. Honestly, honesty always fared her well. And now you know why the buds are in constantly, came the response. Ahsoka didn't answer at all. She only shook her head. Although she couldn't hide the smile, she knew it was betraying her. On a serious note, how is it going down there? And what are the cords for the Liberator? She asked. Well, good, and don't worry about it, Kawani responded slowly over the comm. Good? Have you figured it out already? And what do you mean, don't worry about it? Yes. And 3, 2, 1. Ahsoka was staring out of the canopy, awaiting a verbal response, when she saw two streaks of blue light flash and disappear in the distance. Ani, what the hell just happened? Well, you don't need the cords anymore, that's what happened. R3 and the ship are headed for Z908 Beta 3, Kawani responded clearly, having more fun with this than Ahsoka was. And yes? Ahsoka was genuinely baffled. There was no way in the universe she should have been able to succeed with the task. It was meant to teach failure. She swiveled deftly to her left and activated the cargo bay cam. She felt her jaw drop involuntarily as she watched Kawani perform a flawless first form sequence with a fully ignited saber held Shoto in the appropriate hand. That should be impossible, she said audibly, hearing her own words in the cockpit. She suspended thrust and powered down the engines, leaving the hyperspace motivator on standby. She then unbuckled herself and headed directly for the cargo bay. Please consider a like and sub. It is YouTube's way of getting these to more people. I am less concerned with subs as I am with getting the story out there, and I need your help to do that. Thank you.